Hi, this is Guy Burgess with the second post in a series on using the massively parallel peacebuilding action list as a framework for addressing the authoritarian populism problem. Now, as you may remember, we built this long action list of things that need doing to address intractable conflict in one way or another. What we've done here is gone through that list and highlighted those actions that we think are especially likely to make an important contribution in this context of authoritarian populism. Now, what I'm going to do with this post is give you a quick overview of some of these actions, and with the understanding that this has some danger of getting a bit boring, because long lists tend to be boring, but hopefully I can keep it short enough so that's not too much of a problem. There's also the drinking from a fire hose problem that you may get a sense of information overload from all of this. So keep a couple of things in mind. One is to notice all of the things that need doing to address this problem and put that in context of people who have what I think is an overly simplistic image of the problem, thinking that, well, all we need to do is to win in the next election rather than to change the way in which the society deals with some of its most fundamental problems and resist efforts to sort of exploit those conflicts as a strategy for becoming an authoritarian tyrant, basically. We also need to remember that each of these things on this action list have to be done in countless conflict settings and countless interactions all through the society. It is not enough to just have a few people do it in a few instances. And that leads to another big idea here, which is the importance of specialization. These are the kind of things that any one person can only do a few, so we need a lot of different people working on different aspects of the problems. And finally, remember that you can look up the full list with some nice descriptions on the website, so you don't need to remember all of this. But ask yourself, which of these things might you be able to do to help? Now, I've organized this around our 10 challenges using actually the same slides that I used in an earlier, so just to sort of introduce the challenges. But what we've done is highlighted the actions within each challenge that I think, again, as I've said, have to do with populist authoritarianism and all of that. And within these items, there are a few that I've highlighted in red that I think are especially important. And within the context of figuring out what's going on, I think the most important thing is to see the complexity of the conflict and get past this sort of simplistic us versus them image of what's going on. And we're going to explain in the context of all of this different ways of mapping a conflict. Heidi's going to talk about a lot of different mapping strategies. Paul Ware's initial list, which he was sort of the guy who came up with this idea. And then it's been extended and expanded in a number of other ways. The other thing that Heidi's going to talk about is the distinction between the core issues and a whole set of overlaying conflict problems, which tend to be the other challenges. So the map focuses on, well, the first challenge focuses on getting this kind of broad understanding of a conflict. And then the challenges that remain focus on individual destructive dynamics and alternatives to those dynamics. And this is this core overlay kind of thing. I'm also going to explain what I call the red-blue-gold divide, which is a way of taking the left-right conflict and breaking it down into what I think is a critical number of constituent conflicts. And once you do that, it's a lot easier to see the nature of the authoritarian populism conflict in the context of the left-right conflict. Now, with respect to the second challenge on defending and promoting democracy from those who seek to attack it, using divide and conquer strategies. Again, in this context of authoritarianism, this is a really big deal. And so we need people to identify and resist various divide and conquer provocations. I talked in the earlier post about some of the specific things the Russians have been doing to divide us and things that we've been doing in the name of mobilizing the base. We need some way of focusing attention on all of this stuff and saying, no, we're not going to be divided for selfish political purposes. We also need folks who can teach folks how to defend against and resist the kind of very high-tech propaganda that we're being subjected to based on social networks, Facebook, and all of that, and more importantly, these very sophisticated personality-based propaganda pitches. Another thing that we really need are people to challenge scapegoating and trying to gain power over a society by demonizing and scapegoating other groups. And finally, we've got to protect the rule of law. And if we get to the point where people are trying to get around the law, pretty soon you're to the point where violence and intimidation becomes the way in which disputes are resolved. So again, this second challenge, especially in the context of authoritarianism, is a very important one. We need lots of different people working on these parts of the problem and all the other ones that are listed. We also need folks to work on strategies for more constructively framing the big conflicts within society. And again, from the action list, there are a big list of things that we really think need doing. One of the most important is resisting dehumanization and eventually demonizing the other side to the point where you don't really care what happens to them. And in fact, you can even get to the point of malevolence where you'd like to really hurt them. Another thing that I think would really help is for the two sides to acknowledge that they have, in some important ways, largely by overreaching when they have power, contributed to the divisions within our society and contributed to the problem. One of the key ways of de-escalating a conflict is to recognize and admit and apologize for some of the things that you've done wrong. Another thing that I think would be important, and again, I'm just highlighting a few here, is focus on individual and not group responsibility. In the years after 9/11, we were wise enough to argue again and again and again that all Muslims should not be held accountable for the crimes of a few. It is also important that all liberals or all conservatives not be held accountable for the crimes of a few or the overreaching actions of a few. Another big thing, and this is in the category of reconciling the past and envisioning the future, is we don't really have, I think, a generally accepted vision of the future in which we would like to live that is attractive to both the left and the right. Right now we have two competing visions. So what we need to imagine is a future in which we would both like to live. And this has to promote diversity, but it's more than just diversity in skin color and race and ethnicity, but it's diversity in ideas and lifestyles. And this is diversity that surrounds things that we deeply believe in, and we think that it's really, in an important sense, not tolerable for some other community to live in a different way. And those are really tough issues. So in a sense, what we need is more diversity. We'll talk more about this in subsequent posts because it's absolutely key. Another big challenge is how do we limit and reverse the escalation spiral, which certainly has gotten out of control in this situation. One of the ideas that we talk about on the action list and we'll elaborate on is the notion of using a power strategy mix. It is when you're trying to advocate for your interests, focus more on persuasion and more on exchange and much less on forcing people to do things that they don't want to do. That tends to generate a backlash effect which makes things worse rather than better. Another thing that was really important in terms of not driving the escalation spiral, and something that we're not doing very well these days, is to treat each other, our opponents especially, but also our allies, with respect. And to respect that these are deeply held beliefs and the interests that people are trying to protect are also deeply held. And people may be angry and they may say things that are over the top and outrageous, but treating people with respect tends to de-escalate things, or at least not ratchet things up. Another idea, and there again, remember there are a lot here, is encourage disarming steps. When you have a highly escalated conflict, one of the keys to starting to reverse things is for one or the other parties to make a concession that's so surprising that it forces the other side to rethink their image of the conflict. Hey, maybe they understand us after all. A classic example is Anwar Sadat's bold statement that he would go to Jerusalem to try to make peace with the Israelis. That changed everything. We also need to promote more accurate communication. And again, there are lots of ideas, but the two key ones are to see ourselves as others see us. When we act in the world, we have our own image of how self-righteous we are, but we don't have much of a sense of how our actions are seen and interpreted by others. So we need a whole set of interventions and techniques that help us see ourselves the way the other side sees us. And then we'll discover, hey, we're doing things that make people mad that we don't really need to do. If you can stop that, that can again try to de-escalate things. And the flip side of that is to see others as they really are. Right now, and again, as part of this dehumanization spiral, we tend to focus on the most terrible things that the most extreme elements within the other group does. And it gives us a really distorted view. And the images that we have of the other side are so evil at this point that it's hard to see how we can back away from things. But if you really start focusing the way people are, this is also get out of our bubbles and stuff, that can change an awful lot. Another challenge that we mentioned is how to use and obtain real facts. Again, this is important, especially in the era of fake facts. But just one example of a place where we need a lot of concerted effort is to make people aware of and work to counteract confirmation bias. That is, the tendency to seek out only information that tells you what you want to hear is right and what you've been saying all along is right. And anytime there's information out there that might question what you've done, you just sort of avoid it. And that leads to really distorted views of the world, regardless of where you say you are on this facts or no facts or fake facts debate. So need to do that. We also need to learn how to work together collaboratively. And here I think the most important thing to do, and again there are lots of other things, but the most important thing is to put together a kind of back channel track to effort to negotiate some real compromises that could be reached that would be mutually beneficial for the left and the right. To demonstrate that this unwillingness to collaborate has real costs and that there are collaborative agreements that are possible that would advance everybody's interests, and we aren't even trying to pursue them. But at least get those ideas and those opportunities out on the table so people can see what it is that they're giving up in the name of continuing confrontation. We need to promote good and better governance, obviously. And in this context, especially given the deep distrust people have of government on both the left and the right, which is at the core of this populist revolt, we need a set of measures that really do assure transparent and ethical government. This is real oversight, not oversight that tends to be used as a weapon to favor the left over the right. The other thing that we need to do is we need to encourage a whole series of grassroots interest groups focused on addressing the whole range of shortcomings with democracy and defending society against authoritarian tendencies. And as I've said before, this whole business of trying to mobilize a large-scale effort specialized on the many different aspects of the problem really requires groups to organize and get together to do this. We've got a lot of groups, interest groups out there now that champion particular partisan causes. We need more interest groups championing collective causes, again, in the protection of democracy, the advancement of democracy, and the resistance of authoritarian rule. And finally, in the challenge related to the promotion of the invisible hand, I've highlighted just one thing, but it's a really important thing, is somehow or another, we have to make the economy work for everyone, not just the few and the sort of cosmopolitan elite that are wealthy and really making it. Though an awful lot of folks who are in the elite are working awful hard. They maybe get paid a lot, but it's not really a very high quality of life. But we've got to have an economy that supports everybody. And that's going to take some real changes. And finally, and this isn't quite one of the challenges, but in a sense it's even bigger, is we've got to overcome the free rider problem, the tendency to sit back and say, well, these are all tough problems and working with them is going to be really hard and I'm busy and we'll let somebody else do it. And this goes back to an earlier slide with the famous Pogo cartoon. We've met the enemy and he is us. And that means we all have to be part of the solution. So next steps with respect to this massively parallel peace-building part of the Conflict Frontiers seminar is at this point we've sort of rapidly getting through the initial introduction. And what we're going to be posting over the next couple of months anyway is a series of posts that start looking at specific challenges and specific actions, again on the action list, with a focus on this populist authoritarian conflict that fleshes out some of these ideas that I just touched on very, very briefly, and to try to explain, again in terms of general principles, what needs to be done, who could do it, and how. And as we do this, we still need some money. I mean, we're trying to do this all on a shoestring budget. But we do need some support. So if you're in a position to contribute something towards the creation of new content, the publicity, building of a network, discussion facilitation, and just running the system, we really need your help. Thank you.